Today's topic is love, protection, and consequences. How do we kind of run that balance between protecting our kids, really, and all the people in our lives from negative things that come from difficult or less than ideal choices, and when do we allow them to suffer consequences of those kind of things, and how we can use consequences of actions and choices, um, and then talking about punishment and how kind of punishment and consequences can really work hand in hand. So as we begin, we can just ask this question: what is the goal of parenting? Okay. From a Christian perspective, it's giving our kids back to God. To give them the tools they need to be without us.
To teach them to be responsible citizens and take their place in society.
Yeah, teach them to be responsible citizens. Probably one of the best pieces of advice I ever got from my father was when we had our first child. And he said, the one thing you need to keep in mind is this child was born into your world, you weren't born into his. And if you teach him at an early age that the world revolves around him, he's going to grow to be a teenager and an adult that believes the world revolves around him. And so he said, don't change your life just because you have a child. You just learn how to live life with a child. And so we took them to baseball games and football games. We had season tickets to the Oklahoma Wranglers, which was the arena football team, and we went to the minor league baseball games, and they learned how to adapt, and that's an important kind of a distinction, but teaching them those kind of things. I think, obviously there's some things that we look at from a Christian perspective, but just solely as a parent and a child, I think that's a beautiful image of giving our children back to God. And certainly as Christians, a part of that is, that is the primary aspect of what we are as Christian parents, is that image of, is it Samuel, right? Who's given back to God as a promise, or as a return on that promise of being given a child. And I think about that, and that's a really important aspect of the Christian side of parenting. But just as far as parents go, a primary objective is to ensure their health and their safety, to make sure they're healthy, to make sure they're secure. Secondly, is preparing them for life as adults. That we want our kids to grow, to mature, to learn how to not just survive, but to thrive in a work environment, in relationships, in families, in school. So prepare for life as productive adults. And then this is where the Christian aspect comes in, to transmit cultural values. As Christians, we have our cultural values are going to be distinctly Christian. But all parents have this, the goal is to transmit those values. This is what is important to us. This is why it's important to us. This is what drives us. This is what makes us who we are. And provide them all of the resources then to decide for themselves how they can be productive adults and continue on in that culture that they then can transmit to their own children. So that is the primary objective of raising children. That is hard work. It is hard work. I asked a question several months ago when we first started here. It's been 9 months since we started here. That doesn't seem real, but teaching a class, and I asked this question: what is the most difficult stage of parenting children? The one you're in. That is correct. the stage you are in is the most difficult stage because, they say, talk about the terrible twos, and then your kids turn 3. And then you find out that 3s are considerably different from the 2s, and they're different in a whole different way. And then they learn how to really vocalize their words. They learn how to talk back. They learn how to make decisions for themselves. They also learn how to throw your words back in your face, and they learn that at a very early age. And then they turn into teenagers. Teenagers. And they turn into older teenagers. And, we always joked when Jody turned 13, she was 13 going on 30. And I really believe that we probably could have turned our daughter, Jody, loose at 13, and she probably would have made it in the world because she just had that kind of attitude and mindset and determination. But parenting is hard. Good parenting is hard. It's easy, at least in the short term, to take a road of less resistance. But it doesn't ensure health and safety. It doesn't prepare them for life as productive adults, and it doesn't transmit the cultural values that we have. That's not parenting, that's just coexisting. And so the work of raising kids in this way is hard work. And so many of the issues that we're facing in our culture today is because it's hard. And we have a lot of people that haven't been willing to do the work to raise children in a way that allows them to be productive adults. This isn't foolproof. Kids always are going to grow up to be adults. They're going to make their own choices. But if we'll do the work, then we have a better chance of seeing some things on the other end as they grow up and having healthy relationships with them as adults. Too many times we want to be our kid's best friend, and we lose that authority as a parent when we try to befriend. There'll be a time in your life where you can be a friend with your children. And as we do that work early on, that relationship is so much more fruitful in the end. Because they kind of get to that point in life and look back, and then everything in retrospect can then make sense. And there's a different kind of camaraderie there. So these are the objectives that we have as we're raising kids. These are the scriptures that kind of govern submitting to one another in the fear of Christ. Is one that we'll see throughout this lesson, but also Colossians chapter 3. This is specifically to fathers, but I think this is a good admonition to parents as a whole. Don't exasperate your children. Don't provoke your children, some versions may say. And a lot of times the paths that we choose when we choose to not do the work of holy, godly parenting, that leads to us creating a system, a family system where our children are exasperated. They're exasperated because they don't feel safe, they don't feel secure, they don't know what's coming next. There's no discipline, there's nothing that anchors them, and it's chaotic. You go the other end with the dictator type, where it's, if the only answer my kids ever get when they say why is because I said so. Well, that works for a while and it works in certain situations, but there has to come a time where we can sit and have conversations with our kids about why we do the things we do and why we do them in this way. That's how we transmit our cultural values and demonstrating to them that why we're on this path. So don't exasperate your children. And this is what I think we fight most. How do you take care of the wrong decisions your kids are about to make? You want to go in and fix it for them, right? You see they're about to make a bad choice, and you want to go in and you want to say, hey, are you sure you're going to make that choice? Are you sure? You know what's going to happen? We see a lot of, well, they're not really kids anymore. Now they're young adults, but they're growing up and they don't know how to deal with the consequences of their actions because mom and daddy always fixed everything so they didn't have to suffer any consequences. And why did they do that? Well, they did it because they loved them. They just didn't know what it meant or how to express that love for their kids. Because our instinct as humans is to not let anything bad happen to our kids at any time. What's the problem with that mentality of protecting our children from anything bad to ever happen to them because of a choice they make?
So sheltered that they lack the skills to deal with the real world when they get out on their own.
Yeah, they're so sheltered they lack the skills to deal with the real world once they leave. What else?
They always expect you to fix it.
There's always an expectation that, oh, it doesn't matter. They'll fix it. I mean, if our kids are running towards the street and there's a truck coming down the road, you just don't say, well, I've told them to stay out of the street a whole bunch of times. We're going to see how this works out. Right? Obviously, there's an appropriate time and way to allow our kids to handle consequences and deal with consequences. There are times where we should step in and take care of those things. But along the way, we have to allow our children to suffer the consequences of bad choices. I was reading an article from The Loving and Effective Parent. It's a pretty good little article. And there was an example that they used that I thought was great. There was a mother who was going to take her daughter to practice, and then she was going over for a sleepover at a friend's house. And the daughter decided that she was just going to lip off and say all kinds of things to her mom and talk back and be just ugly. And so the mother just said, it looks like you're going to have to find another way to practice, because I'm not driving anyone in my car that's going to speak to me with that tone of voice. So if you are going to go to practice, then you're going to have to find another way to practice. Oh, and by the way, that sleepover you're going to tonight, you can still go, but I'm not taking you. So you're going to have to find another ride over there if you're going to do the things that you want to do this evening, because I am not going to do it with you speaking to me with that kind of disrespect. And then later on, she said, I'll tell you what, we'll make a compromise. If you want to hire me as your taxi driver, you can. And Uber would cost you this much money. She said, I'll take you to practice for $5, and I'll take you to your friend's house for another $5, and I'll pick you up in the morning for another $5. So if you want to hire me as your taxi driver, I will work for you as your taxi driver, but I am not going to do that. So you can decide how this is going to go for you. The instinctive response is to fly off the handle and say, I can't believe you would do this, and because this and this, yeah. And then the only thing that the child remembers is, the emotion, because look, I have responded emotionally. Most of the time, it's not even when no, that's not true. I responded mostly when they talk back to me. When they talk back to their mother or said something to their mother, like they could hear me coming down the hall and they're like, no, I didn't mean it. And I remember distinctly one time, Dustin was in the bathroom. They were gone through their nightly routine, and he popped off and said something, and Heather said something back to him, and he talked back, and I reached in and I grabbed him by the arm, and I pulled him out of the bathroom and into his bedroom, and like he hit the cabinet on the way out, because there's this big cabinet in the doorway. And it wasn't, the sound it made kind of made my heart drop. And I was like, oh. You see what happens when you respond emotionally, right? And so then the only thing that came out of that interaction was, Dad's mad. And so there was no learning that occurred in that moment, because all the opportunities for learning kind of went off the table. I always bump this back button. The truth is that consequences are a parent's best friend. We can talk about discipline, we can talk about punishment, but we have to learn something, that consequences of our children's choices can be a parent's best friend. If we are willing to do the work of allowing them to suffer those consequences. If our kids choose not to do the homework and then they have a bad grade in the class, are we going to call the teacher and try to find up for ways to make excuses for them to make up the work and do things? Or, are you going to put it back on them and say, look, you got yourself into this mess. You can figure out how to get out of it. And I'm going to tell you, my pet peeve is teachers that let them get out of it. Set a standard. This is a due date. If you're going to turn it in a day late, if you know it's going to be late, you know it's going to be late before it's late. And if you haven't contacted me before it's late, I'm not accepting it. Like, that's how our kids will learn. But we have a whole system that will cater to them. Oh, no, you can turn it in late. It's fine. Like, I busted my tail last semester in the 2 classes I was in to make sure everything was turned in on time. And we would get to the date, the class period that everything was due. And we'd have these kids be like, oh, well, I didn't get that done. Can I have another week? And it's like, yeah, sure, go ahead. Like, hey, that's not fair. Like, what do you mean you're giving them another week? It's been on the syllabus since day 1 when this thing was due. And it wasn't confusing. But that's how we are tempted to raise our kids as well, because we don't want them to suffer the bad consequences of those choices. But allowing them to see that when you make choices, good and bad, right? Because this goes both ways. Because the thing about allowing consequences to teach our kids shows them that there are also good things that come from making good choices. And that just because you made a bad choice and are suffering bad consequences doesn't mean that there aren't a series of good choices you can make to get back into a place where things are going well. And so as we understand consequences, we have to understand some things here. And we're going to look at this, the difference between punishment and consequences. How many of you grew up in a punishment household? I did. You sure? Yeah, I'm sure.
I grew up thinking those words were synonymous because I was always told constant.
Yeah.
I thought they were the same.
Well, they're similar, but you can use consequences as a form of punishment, or you can use them as a form of teaching. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And I didn't really understand the difference either. And some of that may be a cultural shift. Like, I don't know if I ever even questioned my dad when he said, because I said so, because that was my dad's answer for most everything. Because I said so. But that doesn't work on the kind of world that our children are growing up in anymore, because I didn't have Google. Like, I couldn't check to see if my dad was right or wrong. We didn't have access to the kinds of information and technology that our kids are growing up in a world today that's just inundated with that. I couldn't get on and look, and I didn't have a whole community of 1,000+ people of followers on social media that could tell me their experiences in 30 seconds. We didn't have that kind of a sounding board. And so what that does is that raises, a generation of people that reason and process things differently. And the temptation for me is to say, hey, because I said so worked when I was a kid, and it's going to work for you too. And that's just wrong. It didn't work for my kids, for our kids. And that's why we work to teach them and show them to suffer short-term consequences so we can hopefully avoid those long-term consequences, right? And some of the thing, Maya and Hour, like, I parented considerably different than Heather did. Like, Heather wasn't raised in a because I said so household. she was raised completely differently than I was. Her family experience was different than mine was. My dad was a because I said so kind of guy. And I thought, well, worked for me. It's going to work for my son. And that was not true. And it definitely didn't work for my daughter. But Heather could sit down and she could really talk with them, and she could reason with them, and they could have a conversation with her. And it took me longer than it should have to learn how to actually converse and have a conversation with the kids about what and why and how we do things. And so as you have those conversations, you build the trust that then says, when dad says, because I said so, because we have all this trust built up, you're still going to get some pushback on it, right? But that pushback is far less if that's the only answer they've ever heard from you. And I tell you, what I found is the more actual conversation I had when it was appropriate, then later on down the road, even as teenagers, Dustin and Jody especially, they would ask a question and I would say no, and then they would say why. And then Jody especially, she would say, I know, I'll understand someday. And then she would just walk off. But because we had taken the time to have those conversations early on, she still didn't like the answer, but she was more willing to accept it. You've seen that really, especially with her move on into adulthood. Now the Marine Corps, they whipped that out of Dustin really quickly, because he got to boot camp, and then when they got done with boot camp, he went to his ITB training, and they said, oh, everything you learned at boot camp, forget about it. We're going to tell you the right way of doing stuff. And then he went to his MOS school, and they said, hey, all that stuff you learned at ITB, forget it. We're going to teach you the right way to do everything. And literally it is, don't ask questions, because asking questions is only going to get you more physical training or more exercise. So because I said so is a way of life, in that. Let's look at consequences and punishment. Consequences are focused on specific goals. We're trying to move our children to a place of learning where they can grow and mature. Consequences really help us take those steps. They're forward-facing, forward-looking. This is what's coming. You made a choice. This is what's coming. How do we deal with what's in front of us? Punishment is reactive. It looks backwards. It is often emotional. And even though the actions can be the same, the motivation is so different. And the level of dealing, the level of emotion in that dealing is very different. This is, I think, the most common mental state is a lot of times with punishment, it's they're going to pay for this. It's right. But they're going to pay for it. That is already set in, because the truth is, doesn't matter what you do, there are consequences to that action. And so the payment's going to come. When we help, or when we allow those consequences to move us forward, we get into a point of learning, where not just simply retribution for a bad choice. Just said that. Those come from two different motives. Our consequences that we allow should have purpose and control. The consequences I'm going to allow my teenagers to have are not going to be the same that I'm going to allow my 2-year-old or my 10-year-old or my 5-year-old to have. I think one of the biggest battles we faced was at the dinner table. When our kids were babies, they ate everything, and somehow they got to a phase of life where they ate nothing. And the rule in our house was, this is what's for dinner. And let's say the rule started, this is what's for dinner. You may take one no thank you bite if you don't want it, but you're going to take a bite of everything on the table. You don't want it? Fine. Take one bite, say no thank you, and then we're done. I think that was actually movement of the rule. The first rule was, this is what we eat. You're going to sit here and you're going to eat it. And if you don't eat it for dinner, you're going to have it for breakfast, but it's going to be on your plate until it's eaten. That didn't last very long. That rule didn't last very long. I think Jody and I had one standoff where she refused to eat, and she and I sat at that table. I think we sat there for 3 hours. And she finally, and she didn't relent. I think I force-fed her because I was sick and tired of waiting. And I was like, this is not a healthy way to deal with this. So I was like, all right, one no thank you bite. And then after that, it was like, you know what? We're not making 3 different dinners. We're making one dinner. If you want to go make you a peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, you know where the peanut butter is, you know where the bread is, but I'm not doing it for you. And that's what Dylan would often opt for, was a peanut butter sandwich. He didn't want the jelly. And so, but, early on, there were different consequences for those actions. And then later on, it had to be like, okay, like, are we learning anything here? Are we doing anything? Or is this just a fruitless test of wills? And I'm going to tell you, our daughter is a strong-willed young woman. And I am so glad she found a man that can stand in the face of that strong will and just kind of chuckle and go, okay, and just go about life. Funny story there, we're in New York City. When Jody, my daughter Jody, when she gets hungry, she gets hangry. And we had gone to a rooftop, but she loves being on rooftops, and she and I were we were butting heads. She was talking like just sassy. I'm like, yo, you're not going to talk to me like that. I was like, I don't care if you're 18 years old. You're not going to talk to me like that. And we were just back and forth. And Tyler was out there with us. And he said something to her, and she turned around and she kind of snapped at him the way she was snapping at me. I'm like, hey, I'm not alone. And he kind of put his arm around her, and she put her head on his shoulder, and he goes, go get something to eat. And he patted her on the shoulder, and he went and he sat down. And I was like, that's what I should have said. Something had to change, because not only were the consequences not worth it, we weren't learning anything. Both of us were stressed. Both of us were angry, which made Heather stressed and a little angry, but she wasn't angry with Jody. She was angry with me. And she probably had every right to be, because it was a right stance to take. It was a wrong way to take that stance. A better consequence would be, you don't have to eat. But later on, when we're having ice cream, you don't get any because you didn't eat dinner. A better consequence would have been, you're just going to be hungry. And later on, when you're laying in bed and you can't go to sleep, you're just going to be hungry. And maybe you'll think twice about it when we eat breakfast, and then there's all kinds of different ways that those could have been handled differently, but they should have purpose and they should have control. And then as our kids move on, we give them more opportunities to make choices for themselves, even when we know that it might be like, this is not the best thing for you. But if this is what you really want to do, you have a choice to make. But we do have some control, because we don't want them doing anything that they're going to feel the effects of down the road, or that's going to affect their own children or their own families. But we give them those opportunities in smaller things in life so that they learn how to look. Like, the hardest thing is to look into the future and what's going to come from this. It's hard as an adult. I know it was hard as a teenager. And I had to learn all of these lessons as a young adult, as a young married adult. And that made the first few years of our marriage really challenging, because of those vastly different upbringings. I didn't have a lot of freedom. Heather had a whole lot of freedom. And because of that, she learned how to make choices. I learned how to do what I was told. And I got to be an adult, and I didn't want to do what I was told. But I needed somebody to tell me what to do, because I didn't have really good decision-making skills. When we just get into punishment mentality, the recidivism rate of punishment responses just is high, because our kids never make the connection between I made a decision and this consequence comes from that. And so what we see is you see a repetition of the things that got our kids in trouble over and over again, when it is just this act of punishment. And because of that, we see different responses in our kids when those things come up. The hardest thing to do sometimes is to take a step back and take a breath and just assess the situation as adults and say, okay, what needs to transpire here? It doesn't have to be immediate, because oftentimes when it's immediate, it's emotional. And when it's emotional, the only thing our kids see is the emotion and the response. They don't often translate that as an act of love and growth. So taking a moment and really asking, how can we use this moment to move everyone forward? So just kind of summarizing some things, right? Consequences demonstrate real life cause and effect, so our kids can learn how life works. As we mentioned, when they get into jobs, when they get into Christianity, right? I mean, we look at the story of Job. Job shakes his fist at God and asks him, why are you doing this to me? This isn't fair. And God basically just says, who are you? And who do you think I am? Do you forget who I was? If I'm not enough for you, then you don't know me at all. Job never gets an answer for why the things happen to him the way that it does. You're going to have bosses. Our kids are going to have bosses that aren't going to be particularly reasonable. I had a boss when I was in high school, and there are two ways to do things: his way and the wrong way. And it didn't matter how wrong his way was, because it was his way. It was the only way. And that went from how you pump water out of a muddy hole in the ground, to how you put up forms, to how you put away forms, to how you spray forms. He would be telling a crane operator how to do his job. I'm pretty sure that guy's pretty trained, Tim. You're not a crane operator, he is, but he'd be up there telling him how to do it, how he needs to come down a little more, and how he needs to have his chair set and all this. Only grown man ever made me cry. I remember going in at 17 years old and sitting in my dad's truck and crying like a little child. It had been pouring rain for 5 days, and we were on a job site that had it was all mud. We were putting piers in for a tilt wall construction panel in downtown Austin for the Attorney General's building. And my job was to walk around this job site in the pouring rain with 200 feet of fire hose and a sump pump, and to walk around to all of our pier holes and drop that sump pump down and pump the water out and go to the next one. And it was raining, it was muddy, my back hurt, my feet hurt. I've been dragging this pump all around. And then as I would go from hole to hole, he walked out there and he smashed the ground. He's stomping around. He's like, "You're got to be the stupidest beep, 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 beep I've ever seen in my life. Don't you know that you can just put that hole in one hole and you can just dig trenches all the way to that hole, and all the water on this job site would come to that one hole? I don't know why you're dragging this all over." I mean, I'm the only guy working on the job site, and I'm miserable, soaking wet, covered in mud. And this guy's out there just screaming at me, calling me a worthless whole bunch of stuff. And I went and I sat in my dad's truck and I cried, and he came in and he goes, "What's wrong?" I said, "I ain't ever coming back to this job site again." And he said, "Yeah, you are." He says, "In fact, we're coming back tomorrow." We kind of walk through how to handle people like that. There's going to be people there in our lives, and learning how to handle those consequences along the way kind of demonstrates that for our kids. It's emotional, but teaching them how to act with a purpose, and sometimes it's teaching us how to act with a purpose. And so there's some questions here that I want you to think about when it comes to next time we have these opportunities to kind of move us in this direction. The first one is this: am I focused on payback or helping them learn and develop? And I think that kind of goes to the motivation behind what it is that we're about to do. Is this a you're going to get what's coming to you, or a man? There's some things that we need to learn, and this is as much a learning process for us as parents as it is for kids. Are my words targeting the child or addressing the behavior? This is another one that it's a very small adjustment. You're acting like a moron. Well, you just called me a moron. No, I didn't. I said you're acting like a moron. Probably not a good thing to say to your kids in either state, right? But there is a very big difference in addressing action and addressing a character of the person. And when we begin to talk about behavior and action and not about who they are as individuals, and then later on we can talk about character and the nature of why we make those decisions, but not in the moment. But what we begin to tackle is we're not addressing each other, because when we address our kids as when we're looking at them, at the child, when we're talking about these things, we end up creating this head-on mentality that says it's me against you. Whereas when we're addressing the behavior, it is me and my child against the choice that was made. And how are we going to address the consequences that are coming? Because we're on the same team. It's the same way with husbands and wives. When they are in conflict with one another, conflict is good. Anybody ever tells you they have a good, healthy marriage and they've never fought is wrong. Because you have to have conflict to overcome things. But are we going to go face to face to one another, and are we going to create enemies out of each other, or are we going to go shoulder to shoulder and fight against the obstacle? And so focusing on the behavior and the action puts that at the focus. Whereas here we are together figuring out how to move forward. What is the goal of the consequence? Do I have a specific goal in mind? And have I given them some control and a way forward? And I think this, to me, is one of the biggest keys. Is like one of the things that we frequently ask in counseling, whether it's individuals or couples or families, is what would you want your life to look like? And so they paint this picture of what they want their life to look like, or what they want to fix, or what they want to be different. And so then you ask the question, how will you know tomorrow if anything has changed? It's like, well, maybe I'll wake up and the first thing out of my husband or wife's mouth won't be critical or negative. Maybe it'll be, good morning, I love you, how did you sleep last night? That would be a good start. That would be a way that we started the day differently than we ever have before, right? And so you give them some control over how will we know when something is different. Or there is a consequence. The Wilders are in our group, and they respond pretty quickly. Nose on the wall. Sometimes they need help getting to a wall, but they respond pretty quickly with that. And so they'll ask a question. The other one was what? Pockets, right? Hands in the pockets. Yeah. Hands in the pocket, right here. Everybody got to grab a pocket. And I think it was Clark that said, can I let go? And he said, can you be respectful now? Yes, sir. It's a good indicator, right? It's a good indicator. He goes, all right, you can let go. But what he knew was if there was any disrespect or any disobedience, he's probably coming right back to the pocket or going right back to nose on the wall. So can I do this? There's some control over a way forward. Yeah, you can do that. But as long as this stays the same, if this happens again, we're going to come back into this way. You're going to suffer this consequence, and this is what's going to transpire because of your action. However, there is a way for you to get back into a place of comfort. And as long as you do this, 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 and this, then we're going to be kind of okay. And the control on the way forward is a really important aspect of that. Let's pray. God, we thank you for the day and for the time that you have granted us to be here. We pray that you would watch over us as we go from this place into the lives that we lead. I pray that you would help us to just have our homes so focused on you and the love that you showed for us on the cross of Calvary that that shadow would encompass our households. I pray that you would watch over our children, our marriages, our friendships, and the relationships that we have here in this church family. We pray that pray that your love would overflow from our lives and people would know who you are by the way that we live. Help us to be parents that are intent on molding and shaping Christian young men and women that will grow to not only be productive in our culture, but will grow to be productive in your kingdom. We ask these things in the name of Christ our Lord. Amen.